Emily Dawson was a simple woman. She lived in a quiet neighborhood, in a small house with a white picket fence and a garden full of flowers. Her son, Alex, was the center of her world. Every morning, they would go to the park, where he would run and play while she watched with a soft smile. They had their routine. It was peaceful, calm, and ordinary. Nothing too exciting ever happened. That's how Emily liked it. But today was different. There was a strange feeling in the air, something that made Emily's heart beat a little faster than usual. She didn't know why. It was just a regular Tuesday, like any other. The sun was out, the birds were singing, and Alex was laughing as he ran toward the swings. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She glanced around the park, her eyes scanning the area. There were a few other moms, chatting in small groups. A couple of dads were playing catch with their kids. The usual sights and sounds that made the park a safe place. But then, her eyes landed on a group of men standing near the benches. They were dressed in dark clothes, and each of them had a motorcycle helmet tucked under their arm. Emily felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She didn't know why, but something about the men made her uneasy. They didn't belong here. They were out of place in the peaceful, family-friendly park. And the way they were looking at her and Alex, it sent a wave of discomfort over her. Emily tried to ignore the feeling. She turned her attention back to Alex, who was now swinging higher and higher. The wind blew through his hair, and his laughter filled the air, but Emily's eyes kept drifting back to the men. They weren't talking to anyone. They were just standing there, watching. Watching her. Watching Alex. Her heart raced. What were they doing? Why were they staring at her like that? She had never seen them before. They didn't look like the type to come to the park with their kids. No. They looked different. Dangerous. Mom, look. Alex's voice snapped her out of her thoughts. She turned to see him jumping off the swing and running toward her. Be careful, she called out, but she couldn't stop looking at the men. One of them, a tall man with a thick beard and a scar on his face, took a step toward her. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She stood up slowly, moving toward Alex. Hey, the man called out, his voice deep and rough. You're in our spot. Emily froze. She didn't understand what he meant. I'm sorry, she asked, her voice trembling. This park is ours now, he said, taking another step closer. His friends began to move toward her, blocking the path to the playground. Emily looked around, but no one seemed to notice. No one seemed to care. She felt a wave of panic rise in her chest. What was going on? Why were they acting like this? She had never seen these men before. They didn't belong here. Alex, come here, Emily said, her voice sharper now. She held out her hand, and her son ran to her side. She could feel the tension growing with every passing second. The man with the scar smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was a smile that sent a chill down her spine. You should leave, he said. This place is ours now. You're not welcome here. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She had to stay calm. She had to protect Alex. But inside, she felt a storm building. She took a deep breath. I don't know who you think you are, but I'm not going anywhere, she said, trying to sound confident, though her voice shook. The man's smile faded, replaced by a cold, hard stare. You should have listened, he growled. This isn't your park anymore. This is our territory. And if you don't leave, there will be problems. Emily's mind raced. She didn't know what to do. The men were closing in on her. She couldn't let them scare her. She couldn't let them hurt Alex. But she also didn't know what to do next. What could she do? She was just a mom. A single mom. She wasn't a fighter. But then, something inside her shifted. She had to do something. She couldn't just stand there and let these men intimidate her. She couldn't let them win. "I said, I'm not going anywhere," Emily said again, this time with more conviction. She grabbed Alex's hand and pulled him closer, her eyes never leaving the men. The scarred man sneered, taking another step toward her. But before he could say another word, a loud noise cut through the tension. A motorcycle engine roared in the distance. Emily's heart skipped. She knew that sound. "Stay right here," she whispered to Alex, then turned her gaze toward the sound. The men looked confused as the motorcycle grew louder, growing closer and closer. The scarred man glanced around, clearly unsure of what was happening. But Emily knew. She knew exactly who that was. And just as the motorcycle pulled into the park, she saw him. Daniel. Her brother. As Emily's heart raced, she tried to focus on the sound of the approaching motorcycle. The men around her seemed to sense something was changing, and their posture shifted, less confident, more alert. But Emily's focus remained on the road, her eyes scanning the path where the motorcycle's engine grew louder. "Who is that?" the scarred man asked, his voice unsure. He glanced over his shoulder, as if expecting someone else to step out of the bushes or from behind a tree. But it wasn't like that. This was no surprise to Emily. She knew exactly who it was. The motorcycle came into view. It was a sleek black bike, roaring as it passed the park gates. The figure riding it was tall, solid, and unmistakable. Emily's brother, Daniel, had always been the kind of man who commanded attention. The way he carried himself, the strength in his walk, the look in his eyes always made people pause. When he was on his bike, that power seemed to multiply. The men took a few steps back as Daniel slowed down, parking the bike on the far side of the park. His boots hit the gravel with a soft crunch as he stood tall, the military jacket he wore fitted perfectly, his hair short and neat, even in the wind. He didn't even need to speak as he walked toward them. His presence alone was enough to make the men hesitant. Emily's chest tightened, but a sense of relief washed over her. Daniel was here. Everything would be okay now. "Who the hell are you?" the scarred man asked, his voice dripping with hostility. He was still trying to act tough, but his eyes flickered to Daniel, then back to the rest of the group. He wasn't sure how to handle this situation. Daniel took a step forward, his eyes scanning the group. His gaze was sharp, calculating, but there was something else in it, a sense of calm control that Emily knew all too well. He was used to this. Used to danger. Used to making decisions in high-stress situations. And now, it was clear to Emily that he was in his element. "I'm someone who doesn't take kindly to people threatening my sister," Daniel said coolly, his voice low but strong. "So if you know what's good for you, you'll walk away." Now. Emily could see the shift in the men's body language. The tall man who had first spoken was no longer smirking. His eyes darted between Daniel and his friends, clearly unsure of what to do. It was obvious he had not expected anyone to stand up to him like this. Daniel didn't wait for them to decide. He moved forward, his boots pounding the ground with purpose, and the men instinctively took a few steps back. They didn't want any trouble. At least, not with someone like Daniel. The tension was thick. Emily could feel it in the pit of her stomach. Her hand tightened around Alex's, who was now clinging to her leg. His small face looked up at her, eyes wide with confusion, trying to understand what was happening. "Stay close to me, Alex," Emily whispered, bending down to hold him. She wanted to shield him from everything, to keep him safe. But she knew that with Daniel here, there was no need to worry. The scarred man growled, a low, angry sound. "You don't know who you're messing with, man. We don't just walk away." Daniel's eyes hardened. "And you don't know who you're talking to," he said, taking another step closer. I was in the military for over a decade. You don't scare me. So do us all a favor and leave. Now. For a brief moment, there was complete silence. The group of bikers stood frozen, trying to process what was happening. Emily's breath held tight in her chest. She could almost feel the power that radiated from her brother, the certainty that he wasn't going to back down. And neither would she. The scarred man took one last look at Emily, his eyes narrowing as if searching for something. Then he turned to his friends, a silent exchange happening between them. Slowly, they began to walk toward their bikes. Fine. We'll go. But don't think this is over, the scarred man said through gritted teeth. You'll see us again. Daniel didn't flinch. I'm counting on it, he said. His words were final, a sharp edge to them. The group of men climbed onto their bikes and revved the engines. They drove off quickly, their tires kicking up dust behind them. Emily watched them leave, her heart still racing. She turned to Daniel, finally breathing easier now that the threat had passed. Thank you, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Daniel smiled, though it was a small, knowing smile. You don't have to thank me, Em. That's what brothers are for. Emily couldn't help but feel a deep sense of relief. She had always known her brother would protect her if anything ever happened. And now, standing in front of her, he had done just that. But even as the bikers disappeared down the street, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She glanced over at Daniel, and he seemed to understand the unspoken question. You're wondering why they came after you, right? Daniel asked. Emily nodded slowly. Yes. It doesn't make sense. I don't know who they are. I don't know why they were after Alex and me. Daniel's face grew serious. I'll find out, he said firmly. They'll regret messing with you. But for now, let's get out of here. We'll talk later. The park, once a safe haven, felt strangely tense. Emily Dawson had always appreciated the calm, the peace that came with the daily park visits. The familiar sight of children running freely and parents chatting while keeping an eye on their little ones was what she'd come to expect. But today was different. Today, something hung in the air, thick and heavy, like a storm about to break. Emily tried to dismiss the unease bubbling inside her. She focused on Alex, her 8-year-old son, who was happily swinging back and forth, his laughter rising with the wind. It was a sound that usually brought her comfort, but today it seemed distant, almost muted, as if it was coming from a different world. She looked around the park, hoping to shake the feeling. Nothing seemed out of place, mothers chatting in small groups, a father playing catch with his son on the grass. But then her eyes locked onto a group of men near the swings. They stood together, leaning casually against the equipment, their leather jackets shining in the sunlight. Tattoos were visible on their arms, some with designs that looked menacing, like symbols of things she couldn't quite understand. Their faces were hard, their postures tense. They didn't belong here. This wasn't their space. Emily tried to ignore them, to focus on Alex. But her instincts were on high alert. There was something about the way the men were watching her, something unsettling. Her grip on Alex's hand tightened involuntarily. He didn't notice. He was too busy, too happy to see anything wrong. But Emily felt it. One of the men, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with a scar running down his cheek, caught her eye. He wasn't smiling. His gaze was cold, sharp, and it lingered on Alex. She could see the way his eyes moved from her son to her. It wasn't a glance of curiosity or even indifference. It was something darker, something that sent a chill through Emily's bones. She tried to swallow the rising panic, but it was hard. The air felt heavier now, thick with tension. Was it her? Was it the way they were looking at her, or was it something more? Had they been watching her for a reason? Alex, still oblivious to the growing threat, jumped off the swing and ran toward the slide. His feet kicked up the gravel as he laughed, his carefree joy completely at odds with the gnawing feeling inside Emily. She wanted to tell him to stay close, to be careful, but something held her back. It was as if speaking the words out loud would make it real, would make the threat, whatever it was, official. Her eyes darted back to the group of bikers. The scarred man was still watching, but now there were two others standing beside him. One of them had a thick beard, the other wore sunglasses despite the cloudless sky. The three of them looked out of place here, out of place in a way that made Emily uneasy. She shook her head, trying to clear her mind. There was no reason to assume they were dangerous. They were just men, standing there. Maybe they were waiting for someone. Maybe they weren't even looking at her. But Emily's gut told her otherwise. She had learned to trust her instincts over the years, especially when it came to Alex. And right now, every part of her was screaming that something wasn't right. And then, without warning, one of them moved. The man with the scruffy beard stepped away from the group and began walking toward her. His steps were slow, deliberate. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't in a hurry. He had all the time in the world. Emily's heart started to beat faster. She glanced down at Alex, who was still distracted by the slide, completely unaware of the man approaching. She needed to stay calm. She had to protect him. The man's eyes locked onto hers as he closed the distance between them. He wasn't smiling, not really. But his lips curled up at the corners, just slightly. His eyes glinted, filled with something Emily couldn't name but could feel deep in her chest. "You know," the man said, his voice low and rough, "this playground is ours now. Better watch yourself." His words were slow, measured, like he was savoring them. Emily's stomach turned. Was this a joke? Was he testing her? Or was this a warning? She stood still, unsure of what to do. She didn't want to show fear. She didn't want to seem weak, but how could she not? There was something about this man, something in the way he spoke, that made her feel smaller, like a target. "Excuse me," she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, but it came out sounding more like a question than a command. "What do you mean this playground is ours now? We've been coming here for years." The man cut her off. "It's simple," he said, his voice harder now. "This park's ours. You're in our way." A sudden wave of panic rose in Emily's chest. What was he saying? This was her park too. She came here with Alex almost every day. How could anyone just claim it? She looked around for help, but the other parents were still talking, laughing, completely unaware of the tension building in the air. Emily felt alone. She felt exposed. "Are you threatening me?" she asked, her voice trembling now. She couldn't help it. She was afraid. Of what? She wasn't sure yet. But the words coming out of the man's mouth weren't the words of someone looking to make friends. The man's eyes narrowed, his smile fading. "No. I'm just telling you how it is. You don't belong here anymore. Not unless you're willing to pay the price." "Pay the price?" Emily repeated, her heart racing. "What are you talking about?" The man chuckled darkly, taking a step closer. "Don't worry about it. You'll find out soon enough." And then, before she could respond, the man turned and walked back toward the other bikers. Emily's breath came in shallow gasps. She watched as they gathered together again, talking among themselves. It felt like the calm before a storm. The park, once a peaceful escape, now felt charged, dangerous, and Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was coming. She looked down at Alex again. He was happily climbing the steps to the slide, unaware of the looming danger. She wanted to run, to grab his hand and get out of here before anything worse could happen, but she couldn't. She couldn't let fear control her. She couldn't let these men take away her peace. But the park didn't feel peaceful anymore. And then, as if to confirm her worst fears, the biker with the scar on his face stepped forward again. This time, there was no casual walk. He was approaching her directly, his steps heavy, his expression serious. Emily's pulse quickened. Was he coming to make good on his threat? Would he hurt her, or worse, hurt Alex? Emily felt a cold shiver crawl down her spine, but she refused to let herself flinch. She had been through harder situations before, times when the world had seemed to close in on her, times when everything felt uncertain. But this felt different. The air seemed thicker today, and the bikers were circling her, like wolves testing their prey. They made jokes, taunting her, their laughter ringing out, but the sound of it didn't reach her ears the way it should have. It was like a noise that came from far away, distant, muffled by the fear growing inside her. It was more than just their words. It was the way they moved around her, blocking her path, making sure she couldn't escape. They were enjoying this, enjoying the control they had over her son. Emily could feel their eyes on Alex, their gazes lingering too long, too hard. The way they looked at him made her blood run cold. She knew that look all too well. It was the kind of look that made her instinctively step closer to her son, pulling him in toward her side. There was something beneath the surface of this moment. Something that Emily couldn't quite put her finger on. But she knew it was there. She could feel it, like a storm gathering in the distance. She couldn't explain it, but it was real, and it was coming for her. The bikers, sensing her discomfort, pushed further. One of them, a man with a deep voice and a smirk that never seemed to fade, stepped closer to her, making sure she couldn't move. He crossed his arms over his chest, leaning in, his breath hot on her face. "You're making a mistake," Emily whispered under her breath, her voice barely audible over the taunting laughter around her. Her words got lost in the thick air, swallowed by the tension that hung like a heavy weight. But she didn't care. She wasn't saying it to be heard. She wasn't trying to convince them. It was a statement meant more for herself than for them. The bikers didn't seem to care about her warning. They were having too much fun, too much power in this moment. They pushed her, prodded her, making jokes that were cruel and meant to make her feel small. Emily's body stiffened, but she stood tall. She refused to let them see how much they were affecting her. She wasn't going to back down. Her mind raced as she glanced around, her eyes darting from the bikers to the nearby families and parents who were scattered throughout the park. No one else seemed to notice. No one else was aware of the danger lurking just a few feet away. The parents were still talking, their voices carrying on as if everything was normal. The children were still playing, laughing, unaware of the tension hanging in the air. It made Emily feel isolated, alone, as if the world had moved on while she was trapped in this small pocket of danger. She couldn't let them get to her. She couldn't let Alex see that she was afraid. She had to stay calm, had to protect him. But as the bikers continued to push, to mock, Emily felt the weight of it all pressing down on her chest. It was like the walls were closing in, the air growing thick, her heart pounding in her ears. And then, in the middle of the chaos, the silence came. It wasn't the kind of silence that could be comfortable. It wasn't peaceful or calming. No, it was the kind of silence that made everything feel fragile. It was the silence before something big happened, like the moment before a thunderstorm rips through the sky, when everything is still and you can feel the electricity building in the air. In that stillness, Emily's pulse raced. She held her breath, waiting. And that's when she heard it, the sound of a motorcycle engine revving in the distance. Her heart skipped a beat, and she felt a strange sense of recognition. It was a sound she knew too well. A sound that was as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. The engine roared louder as it drew closer, and Emily's body tensed. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The motorcycle was unmistakable, the sound of it too familiar. It was her brother, Daniel. Emily's heart gave a strange mix of relief and dread. She knew that Daniel would never stand by and let this kind of thing happen, especially not when it came to his family. He wouldn't let these men continue to intimidate her. But at the same time, she couldn't ignore the fear that bubbled up in her chest. What would happen when Daniel arrived? Would he be able to handle this situation? Or would it escalate even further? She glanced toward the parking lot, her eyes scanning the area, searching for him. And then, just as the sound of the motorcycle grew louder, Emily saw him. He was riding his bike toward the entrance of the park, his broad shoulders visible even from a distance. He was dressed in his usual military jacket, his helmet tucked under one arm. His expression was unreadable, but there was no mistaking the determined way he held himself. The bikers noticed him too. Their eyes shifted, and the mocking smirks on their faces faltered just for a moment. Emily saw it in their eyes, the hesitation, the uncertainty. They didn't know who this man was, but they knew he wasn't someone to be trifled with. Daniel's bike roared to a stop just a few yards away from the group of men, the engine still humming. He didn't get off right away. He stood there, letting the silence settle around him. He knew how to command attention without saying a word. He knew how to make people wait for him, to feel the power of his presence before he even spoke. The bikers exchanged glances. The man with the scar, the one who had been eyeing Alex, took a step forward, clearly trying to assert dominance, but even he seemed unsure now. He crossed his arms over his chest, his jaw clenching, but Daniel didn't move an inch. His eyes were locked on the man, not with anger, but with a quiet, measured confidence that made the air feel heavy with anticipation. For a moment, no one moved. The world seemed to freeze in place. Emily stood in the middle of it, her breath shallow, her heart still pounding. She wanted to say something, to warn Daniel, but there was no need. He already knew. He always knew. Daniel finally dismounted from his bike, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. He adjusted his jacket, and Emily could see the tension in his shoulders. She had seen him like this before, calm, controlled, but ready for whatever came next. The scarred man took another step toward him, his voice dripping with mockery. "What's this? You gonna fight us now?" he sneered, trying to keep his voice steady, but Emily could hear the uncertainty in his tone. Daniel didn't answer right away. He just took another step forward, his eyes never leaving the man's face. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady. "I'm not here to fight," he said, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to make the air grow even heavier. "But if you don't leave my sister and my nephew alone, I will." The bikers shifted uncomfortably. The man with the scar hesitated, clearly unsure of what to do next. Emily could see the change in the atmosphere, the shift in power. It was subtle, but it was there. She could feel it in the air. The bikers were no longer in control. Daniel was. The tension was thick now, and Emily knew that whatever happened next would change everything. The sound of the roaring engine reverberated through the park, cutting through the tension like a hot knife. Emily's breath caught in her throat, and for a split second, she felt the world around her go still. The laughter and jeering from the bikers seemed to fade into the background as the familiar sound of a motorcycle drew closer. It was like the noise of everything else had been swallowed up by that one unmistakable roar. She could feel her pulse racing in her ears, her heart pounding as the engine grew louder. And then, out of the haze of noise and movement, he appeared. Daniel. The sight of him brought a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief, because she knew that, no matter what, Daniel would protect her. He was her brother, after all. But dread, because she also knew that things were about to change in a way that would be out of her control. The air was thick with tension, and she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. Daniel didn't just ride up like any ordinary man. No, he was different. His presence alone commanded attention. His military demeanor was unmistakable. The way he sat on the motorcycle, upright and alert, made him seem like a force to be reckoned with. Every movement he made was deliberate, calm, and precise. He wasn't just some guy trying to settle a petty dispute. He was a man who had been trained for things far bigger than this. He dismounted from the bike with the grace of someone who had done it 1,000 times. His uniform, neatly pressed under his jacket, was a sharp contrast to the leather-clad bikers. His eyes were focused, steely, locked onto the scarred biker with a gaze that could cut through steel. He didn't have to say anything for the bikers to know that they were no longer in control. The playground, the park, the entire world seemed to center around Daniel in that moment. Emily watched in silence as Daniel approached, his boots making a soft thud against the ground with every step. The bikers, who had once been so confident, so sure of their power, now seemed to hesitate. They were trying to read him, trying to figure out what kind of man he was. But they couldn't. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The scarred biker, still trying to assert some kind of dominance, spat on the ground and took a step forward. His hand rested on the hilt of a knife tucked into his belt. "You," he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think you can just show up here and scare us off? This playground is ours now. We run things here. So why don't you turn around and leave while you still can?" But before the biker could finish the sentence, Daniel spoke. His voice was low, steady, and powerful. It was the kind of voice that commanded respect, a voice that made the air feel thick with authority. "If you're looking for trouble, you've found it," Daniel said, his words cutting through the tension like a blade. The bikers froze. Emily could see it in their eyes. They weren't just taken aback, they were scared. This wasn't some random guy they could push around. This was a man who had faced real danger, who had been in situations where life and death hung in the balance. They might have thought they could intimidate a single mom and her son, but now they were up against someone they hadn't expected. For a long moment, there was no sound except for the steady beat of Emily's heart in her chest. The bikers were silent, their eyes flicking between each other and Daniel, as if trying to decide what to do next. Emily stood frozen, unable to look away from her brother. Her breath was shallow, her chest tight with anxiety, but there was also something else, something deeper. Something that felt like hope, a faint, distant glimmer that maybe, just maybe, they were going to be okay. The scarred biker shifted on his feet, clearly uncomfortable. He was used to being the one in control, the one who made the rules. But now, in front of Daniel, he wasn't sure anymore. The confidence that had once filled his posture was wavering, his hand twitching at his side. He didn't want to admit it, but he was starting to realize that he had underestimated Daniel in a way he couldn't fix. "You think you can just walk in here and change everything," the biker growled, trying to find his footing again, but his voice lacked the usual conviction. Daniel didn't flinch. He didn't take a step back. He stood his ground, his eyes never leaving the man. His voice, when he spoke again, was calm, but there was an edge to it that made the bikers take a step back. "I don't have to change anything. All I'm asking is that you leave. And if you don't," he paused, letting the silence stretch out between them, "then we'll have a problem." There was a long pause. Emily could feel the weight of it pressing on her, the silence wrapping around her like a thick blanket. The bikers were still, unsure of how to react. They had no idea what they were up against. And then, suddenly, the scarred biker moved. But it wasn't a move that Emily had expected. He took a step back, his posture slumping slightly. The knife at his side, which had been so proudly displayed a moment ago, now seemed less of a threat. The other bikers followed his lead, one by one, taking slow steps back. For a second, Emily couldn't believe what she was seeing. She had never seen a group of bikers back down like this before. She had seen them push people around, seen them take whatever they wanted without question. But now, they were backing off. They were afraid. "Get in the van," the scarred biker muttered under his breath, turning to his friends. "We're done here." The rest of the bikers, visibly uncomfortable, started to file toward their motorcycles. The leader didn't look back, but he didn't need to. His group was already following his orders, the fear in their eyes unmistakable. Daniel stood tall, watching them go, his eyes scanning the group as they scattered. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't gloating. He didn't need to. His presence alone had been enough to end the conflict. The bikers had realized, too late, that they had crossed a line. They hadn't expected Daniel, and now, they were paying the price. Emily couldn't believe what she had just witnessed. Her brother had stepped in, and with just his words, his presence, he had defused the situation. The bikers, who had moments ago been threatening her and Alex, were now nothing more than a distant memory, retreating back to their bikes like children caught in a lie. For the first time since the confrontation began, Emily took a deep breath. The tension in her body began to slowly fade, though she still couldn't quite believe what had just happened. Her brother had saved them. Not with force, not with violence, but with something far more powerful: his calm strength, his unwavering confidence, and his presence. The bikers were gone. The park was quiet again, and the world around Emily seemed to settle into place. But she knew, deep down, that things would never be the same. The moment had changed her. It had changed Alex. And it had changed Daniel, though he would never admit it. But the truth was undeniable: they had faced down danger, and they had come out victorious. Emily looked at her brother, her heart swelling with gratitude. He turned to her, his expression softening for the first time since he arrived. He walked toward her, and without saying a word, he pulled her into a hug. It wasn't a long hug, but it was enough. It was everything she needed in that moment. "You're safe now," Daniel whispered into her ear, his voice full of warmth and reassurance. And for the first time all day, Emily allowed herself to believe it. They were safe. At least for now. The bikers stood there, staring at Daniel, their eyes flicking from his calm, unwavering gaze to each other, unsure of what to do next. The air was thick with tension, but Daniel didn't flinch. He didn't move a muscle. His presence alone, the quiet strength he exuded, seemed to make the entire world around them hold its breath. The scarred man, who had once seemed so confident, now looked more like a bully who had suddenly realized he wasn't as tough as he thought. One by one, the bikers began to back off. At first, it was subtle: a slight shift in posture, a glance exchanged between the group. Then, it became more noticeable. The scarred man's hand, which had been resting on the knife at his belt, slowly drifted away. He wasn't scared of the knife anymore. He was scared of Daniel. And in that moment, it was clear Daniel wasn't just any man. He wasn't someone to be pushed around. He wasn't someone you could threaten or intimidate. He was a force of nature. "Get out of here," Daniel said again, his voice as steady and as strong as ever. His words weren't laced with anger, but they didn't need to be. The way he said it, calm, deliberate, with that piercing focus, told the bikers everything they needed to know. They were done. The scarred man opened his mouth to protest, but no words came. He stood there for a long moment, trying to regain his composure, trying to find some way to turn the situation back in his favor. But there was nothing he could say. Nothing he could do. The bikers were defeated, not by force, but by something far more powerful: Daniel's confidence. With a collective grunt, the bikers began to mount their motorcycles. The sound of the engines roaring to life was almost like a whisper compared to the deafening silence that had fallen over the playground. The sound of the engines faded, and with it, The bikers disappeared into the distance, leaving behind nothing but the dust they had kicked up as they sped away. Emily stood frozen, her heart still racing, but now it was a different kind of racing. It wasn't fear anymore, it was relief. The bikers were gone. The threat had passed. And the best part was that Daniel had handled it all without breaking a sweat. It had all happened so fast, but it felt like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She wasn't alone in this. Not anymore. As the sound of the motorcycles faded away, Emily let out a slow, shaky breath. Her knees felt weak, but she stood tall, steadier now than she had been moments before. She turned to look at Daniel, who was standing nearby, his eyes still scanning the area as if making sure the threat was completely gone. When his eyes met hers, something soft flickered in his expression, a small smile, a quiet acknowledgement. It was as if they didn't need to say anything. He had done what he needed to do, and she was safe. That was enough. The park, which had felt like a battlefield just moments before, now seemed peaceful again. The laughter of children playing on the swings, the chatter of mothers sitting on benches, the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze, it was all back to normal. But to Emily, nothing would ever feel the same again. Not after what had just happened. "Thank you," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible, but the gratitude in her words was clear. She took a step toward her brother, her arm still shaking slightly, but her heart lighter. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't shown up." Daniel gave her a small, reassuring nod. "You don't have to thank me. I'm your brother. I've got your back. Always." Emily smiled, feeling a sense of warmth spread through her chest. It was true. Daniel was always there for her, no matter what. She had known that, deep down, but today had reinforced it in a way she couldn't ignore. No matter how alone she had felt in that moment, no matter how out of place the bikers had made her feel, she had never truly been alone. Not with Daniel around. She turned to look at Alex, who was still standing by the swings, his eyes wide with confusion. He didn't fully understand what had just happened, but he could sense the change in the air. He could feel the tension lifting, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, Emily felt like she could finally breathe. "Hey, buddy," she called softly, walking toward him with Daniel by her side. "You all right?" Alex nodded, his small face still puzzled. "What happened, Mommy?" Emily crouched down to his level, brushing a strand of hair from his face. She smiled gently. "It's over now, sweetheart. We're safe." Alex's eyes seemed to search her face for any hint of doubt, but when he saw none, he relaxed, his small shoulders dropping. "I'm glad you're okay, Mommy," he said in his innocent, trusting voice. Emily's heart swelled with love for her son. He had been so brave, so strong, throughout the entire ordeal. But now, in this moment, she realized just how much strength she had in her own life, the strength of her family. The strength of her brother. As they walked away from the playground, Daniel's presence still felt like a shield around them, protecting them from the chaos that had just unfolded. They made their way to the car, and Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of peace settle over her. Everything was going to be okay. The bikers were gone, and no one could take away the safety they had found in each other. Once they were all in the car, Daniel started the engine, and they drove away from the park, the world outside looking brighter, more hopeful. Emily glanced out the window, watching the scenery pass by as the sun began to dip lower in the sky. It was a beautiful evening, one that promised better days ahead. As the car rolled down the quiet streets, the final rays of the setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and orange. Emily sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded in her lap, her thoughts quiet but deep. The events of the afternoon felt surreal. It was hard to believe how quickly everything had escalated at the park, but it was even harder to believe how it had ended. It felt like a lifetime ago when the bikers had first approached her, threatening her and her son, but now, she was on the road again, heading home, safe. Beside her, Daniel drove with calm, steady hands on the wheel. He didn't say much, but there was a certain look in his eyes, one of pride, one of quiet satisfaction. Emily noticed it. It was the same pride she had seen in his eyes whenever he spoke of his time in the military. He was proud of what he did. Proud of the man he had become. And in some strange way, Emily realized, he was proud of her too. It had been a long, hard day. But more than anything, it had been a reminder. A reminder of what she had inside her. She didn't need to be anyone's hero. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone. But she had risen to the occasion when it mattered most. And in doing so, she had discovered a strength she didn't know she had. A strength that went beyond physical power. A strength that came from her will, her heart, and her love for her son. As they drove in silence, Emily thought about what Daniel had said earlier, when the bikers had finally left. "You didn't need me," he had said. "You handled it?" Emily had smiled then, her heart full. She had been scared, yes. But there was a fire inside her that had never gone out. Even when the world seemed to close in around her, even when she felt like giving up, she had always found the strength to keep going. And today, that strength had been enough to face down a group of dangerous men who had underestimated her. She had learned something about herself in the process. And she had learned something about Daniel too. The bond they shared, the family they had, was a force in itself. They were both survivors. They had both seen their share of darkness, of struggle. But together, they were unstoppable. "You didn't need me," Daniel had said again, his voice low but proud. Emily had turned to him, her gaze steady and strong. "I may not need you," she had replied. "But I'm glad you're here." The words were simple, but they meant everything. Daniel had always been there for her, whether it was protecting her when she needed it or offering her the kind of quiet strength that only a brother could provide. He had been her rock. And today, he had been her shield. But what mattered most was that she had learned how to stand tall, even without him standing beside her. The road stretched ahead, the sky growing darker as they left the park and the danger behind. But Emily knew something had changed in her. She had always been strong, but today, she had shown just how strong. It wasn't about fighting back with fists or loud words. It was about standing firm, about refusing to let fear control her. She hadn't backed down, even when the odds seemed stacked against her. And Daniel had been right, in his own way. She didn't need him to fight her battles. She had fought them on her own. But what mattered more was the knowledge that, no matter what, he would always have her back. That, in itself, was enough to make her feel invincible. As the car neared their neighborhood, Emily looked out the window, watching the familiar houses pass by. The world outside seemed unchanged. But she knew she had changed. The quiet, unassuming woman who had walked into the park earlier that day, unsure of what was to come, was no longer the same. She had discovered something inside herself, a power, a resilience that would carry her through whatever challenges lay ahead. The journey had been long, but it had also been revealing. Emily had learned that sometimes, the quietest ones are the most dangerous. The ones who seem the least able to fight back are often the ones who rise up the strongest. It wasn't about having the most power or the loudest voice. It was about knowing who you were, standing your ground, and never backing down. It was true what they said, still waters run deep. And Emily had always been a still water. On the outside, she had seemed calm, collected, maybe even a little invisible. But under the surface, there had always been a strength building. A strength that, when tested, had proven itself more than enough. Daniel glanced over at her as he turned the corner, his expression unreadable but comforting. Emily smiled softly, knowing that they had both been tested in ways they hadn't expected. but here they were, still standing, stronger than ever. "You're a lot stronger than you think," Daniel said, breaking the silence. Emily chuckled lightly, but there was truth in his words. She had always thought of herself as just a regular person, just a mom, just someone trying to get through the day. But today, she had been more than that. She had been a protector. A fighter. A woman who wasn't afraid to stand up for what mattered most. As they pulled into the driveway of her house, Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of pride welling up inside her. Not just for herself, but for her son too. He was safe. He was protected. And in that moment, she realized that she would do whatever it took to keep him that way. She had found her strength, and she would carry it with her always. They parked the car, and Daniel cut the engine. The quiet of the evening settled around them. The world outside was calm now. But inside, Emily knew that the world would never look at her the same way again. Because sometimes, the most powerful people are the ones you least expect. And today, Emily Dawson had shown just how powerful she truly was. The future was uncertain. But whatever it held, Emily knew she would face it head on. She had the strength, the courage, and the love of her family to carry her through anything that came her way. And that, she realized, was all she needed. "Thank you," she said quietly, turning to Daniel one last time. "For everything." Daniel smiled, his gaze warm but knowing. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad to be here." As they both got out of the car and walked toward the house, the evening air cool and calm around them, Emily couldn't help but feel at peace. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. Strong, resilient, and surrounded by the people who mattered most.